Half a century, the world was divided. This was a time of great fear. Tensions between the warring powers were constantly at a high, and the threat of nuclear annihilation was in everyone's mind. There was a great fear that one day enemy soldiers could be in your own backyard. But for almost a year in the state of Colorado, the people of the United States did experience the war themselves. With a population of about 13,000, Calumet, Colorado serves as the picturesque American suburban town. However, this small, quaint town would be rocked by the Cold War. Join us as we explore the events surrounding the 1984 insurrection led by a group of teenagers that would ruin the peace and tranquility of this small town. In 1984, Europe stood divided behind an iron curtain, separating communist East from capitalist West. In 1983, the United States and Allies conducted one of their war games, Able Archer. This plan was so massive and so large, so well detailed to simulate war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, that the Soviet Union believed that they were about to be attacked. Tensions ran high. Fortunately, the Soviets eventually figured out that this was indeed just a game, and nuclear war was prevented, but tensions would still remain high throughout the remainder of the decade. Part of these extensive war games would involve utilizing the small town of Calumet, Colorado, to simulate a Soviet occupation of American soil to better prep the American population for the possibility of an invasion, and also to give the military more ideas on how to resist such an invasion. One of the features of this so-called invasion would be the setup of a Soviet-American Friendship Center to promote friendship between American and communist ideals, similar to such centers that have been set up in various Warsaw Pact countries around the world. A group of local teenagers from Calumet began to communist forces. For some reason, which is still unknown as to why, they not received the memo that this was a military exercise. While the details are unclear, what is clear is that these children eventually formed a resistance group that they called the Wolverines. For the rest of this documentary, we'll be detailing the exploits of this so-called resistance group. The first instance of terrorism by this group of teenagers occurred at Arparello National Park, near the city of Calumet, Colorado. 3 soldiers, a part of military exchange program with NATO, 2 from the Soviet Union and 1 from Cuba, were visiting this national park. The teenagers happened to be in the forest at the time, and spotting these 3 communist soldiers, begun their insurrection. Part of this national exchange program saw 1 West German, 1 British, and 1 American soldier visiting the Soviet Union. These soldiers were in Leningrad, viewing museums and monuments to the Russian Revolution. When the murder of their 3 communist counterparts in the United States reached them, they were put under arrest by Soviet authorities, causing a great international incident that almost turned to war. However, strong negotiation on the parts of both communist and NATO leaders eventually led to the release of the 3 NATO soldiers. The release of these soldiers would be met with demands for investigation into the murder of the 3 communist soldiers at the national park near Calumet. The arrival of Soviet investigators, however, would help build towards the escalation of hostilities near Calumet, Colorado, as the teenagers continuously begun to believe that their country was occupied by communist forces.
The boys!
From this moment on, the children would commit various terrorist acts, believing they were striking against a supposed Soviet occupation force. Nobody was safe. Everyone from electronics workers repairing telephone lines to machine and factory workers. The children believed they were striking against collaborators with the Soviet occupation force, or against Soviet soldiers and engineers themselves. However, of course, these were often just regular civilians who were not even armed, but in the psychotic minds of these children, they were fighting enemy soldiers. The wake of the destruction they would cause across the county would devastate the economy of various towns and villages, and eventually would prompt a federal government response. Around the time this was taking place, a Lieutenant Colonel Tanner of the United States Air Force was flying over the region of Calumet, Colorado. However, his F-15 experienced technical failures, and he was forced to bail out over the forests nearby the town. The teenagers would see his chute and go to locate him, believing him to be an American pilot who could give them intel on Soviet and communist locations in their region. The children began to interrogate Colonel Tanner, using his intelligence and remembering reports of wild children in this area, knew that to survive he would have to lie to them. As they began pressing him for questions about locations of enemy forces and the like, he continued to lie to them, confirming their belief that Soviet forces had occupied the area and that he was engaged in fighting their air force. He did everything possible to try to encourage them to keep him alive. Unfortunately for the colonel, as time would pass, Stockholm Syndrome would set in, and he too would begin to believe that communist forces had occupied the area of Calumet, Colorado. He would begin to take a leadership role over the children, directing their organization and leading their assaults on supposed enemy encampments and forces. Under his direction, they would plan their biggest assault yet.
Maneuver, and when you reach this bunker, you lay down grazing fire in this defilade. I think that's pretty simple.
A few weeks later, the colonel's plan would be set into motion. The rebels believed that the city's drive-in movie theater was being used as a prisoner of war camp. Their plan involved attacking the drive-in theater, creating distractions by setting off explosives in nearby gas stations and fuel depots, and assaulting the city's airstrip. During this raid, many civilians who'd come out to watch that night's screening were shot as believed Soviet soldiers. Workers at the gas stations and the airstrip also were shot. The death toll was high, and the amount of destruction done to civilian and city property was extensive. As winter set in, the United States military, in conjunction with the Tank Corps and the Air Force, decided to conduct military war games in the area near Calumet, Colorado. However, this of course presented a target for the teenage rebels. The so-called enemy tanks that were taking part in the war games were believed to be actual enemy tanks, and the extensive bombing raids conducted by the Air Force were also believed to be real. The teenage rebels decided that they would take part in the so-called battle and do what they could to take out the so-called enemy tanks. However, this would go poorly for the teenagers. A supposed Soviet tank approached their position. Taking cover and planning a quick battle strategy, they decided they would take out the supposed enemy tank. Before they could execute their plan, one of their members began to have screaming fits of hysteria. The colonel, in desperation to calm him down, rushed the tank and began shooting into it. Another tank nearby spotted them and began shooting at them. During the engagement with the second tank, one of their members would be killed. This would be the first casualty. The colonel would be the next victim, as one of the enemy tankers threw out a grenade, which exploded and sent a large amount of shrapnel into his back. Knowing that he was done for, the colonel would throw a smoke grenade on top of the tank, marking it as a target for the supposed friendly tanks on the battlefield. This last action was a sacrificial move in hope of saving the rebels. Following the incident with the tank war game, the teenagers returned to raiding convoys and local shopping stores to keep themselves alive. At this point, the governor, in cooperation with the United States President, authorized the army to take measures against these now labeled terrorists. Army helicopters finally zeroed in on their location and began raiding the teenagers. At this point, the bloodiest day in their almost year-long escapade would begin. The teens, of course, would not go down without a dramatic last stand. This unfortunate day for the Wolverines would add a few more names to their growing list of fallen, quote, heroes, unquote. In order to seek revenge and consolidate their losses, the teenage rebels then decided for one last major raid. They would attack the town of Calumet, Colorado themselves. The National Guard had been called in by the governor and the president to defend the town. However, this only escalated things as the children thought that these American soldiers were actually communist forces. This would, of course, attract their attention for their last great raid. Within the first few minutes of their attack, the death toll was staggering, and the destruction to public property was in the millions. Armed with captured explosives and RPGs, the teenagers began going through the town, seeking to disable and or destroy as many IFVs, APCs, and tanks that they could. They also began attacking National Guard installations with grenades and other explosives, increasing the death toll highly.
Come on, let's go!
A secured Army communications center, which was used to keep telephone and other communication systems intact during the teenagers' attack, was destroyed by them, cutting the town of Calumet, Colorado off from the outside world. Beginning to run low on ammunition and split apart from the rest of their group, two of the teenagers, brothers, hopped on an army transport train to try to get out of town. Unfortunately for them, they had been spotted and took fire while they came to the edge of town. One of the brothers would be hit. With the youthful foolishness of bravery, the older brother would attempt to seek revenge for his younger brother, but it would not end too well for him.
You lose.
Carrying his brother outside of town, but overladen with the burden and the extent of his wounds, the older brother would eventually collapse in the local park. Realizing that he would not be able to escape, and not willing to abandon his brother, the older brother eventually would sit down and accept the inevitable fate that awaited him.
Come on, man. Daddy be here soon. Hold you as long as I can, man. Hold you as long as I can. You lean on me. Bro, I'm so tired. So tired.
With the children now dead, and order restored by the National Guard to the region of Calumet, a memorial to those who were murdered by the insane teenagers was set up, and also to condemn and remember the actions of those children. The state of Colorado would never forget this unfortunate series of events. The United States government, after this terrible incident, would never again conduct war games on its own soil, for the cost in blood had been too high. America would never suffer another Red Dawn.